can't just talk about bubbles by looking when prices go up or down, because sometimes prices go up for justifiable reasons, or they go down for justifiable reasons. So you have to look at other phenomena that accompanies when bubbles. And things that really have motivated me is three sets of observations. The first is that when do bubbles start? The bubble tends to start in periods of a lot of uncertainty about technology, and technology here has to be understood in a very wide sense. For instance, sometimes we're talking about changes in the way we do financial transactions. You know, it doesn't have to be a new chip or the internet or something like this, although it does happen in this case. So that's the first observation. The second observation, that bubbles are accompanied by trading frenzies. People trade a lot during bubbles. And it's interesting because we economists don't have a good explanation why people trade so much. Even in normal times, we have a difficult, it's difficult for us to explain why do people trade so much. You know, most of our models will predict that unless we get some kind of liquidity shock, we shouldn't be trading. And why is it that there's so much trading in general is a difficult question, but it's even more when you look at episodes of bubbles, that in these episodes people trade a lot. And the third, which is a really economic question, which has been somewhat ignored in the bubble literature, even the economics literature on bubbles, is how do bubbles end? The ending of bubbles for me is one of the most interesting phenomena because it's really an economic phenomena. It's really, and we can talk more about this, bubbles end because people figure out how to make money out of the bubble. So they increase the supply, whatever is bubbling, and that kind of drives prices down. You know, bubbles sometimes have an effect on systemic risk, and sometimes they don't. Often, there have been bubbles which have been pronounced, but with very little systemic effect. And an example of this is what usually called the internet bubble that imploded in the early 2000s. There was almost no, the effect on the economy. There was some effect, you know, but not large relative to the common economic cycle. When a bubble goes through the financial system, and the financial system has a lot of its capital committed to assets which involve the bubble, and then the bubble implode, then you have sometimes very large systemic consequences. So the bubble, not only on housing, but in many types of fixed income securities that occurred in the aftermath of the internet bubble implosion. That bubble, which imploded, you know, you can start dating around 2007. That one had great big consequences because the financial system, which is really important in intermediating capital, suffered a big loss, and suffered a big loss because they had speculated a lot in that bubble, as opposed to the internet bubble that, partly for institutional reasons, there was a small amount of speculation by the banks, by the financial system in the internet bubble. Well, there are gaps. I think there has been a lot of progress made, especially after the crisis of 2007. There was a lot of progress made in this area. We're trying to understand exactly how did the banks acquire so many assets that were tied to housing, eventually tied to housing. How come European banks lent so much money to Greece? So all those things together, I think there has been a lot of progress on that, and the need to regulate this. And I think we made some progress in regulation. There's always, of course, the countervailing effect. Sometimes we regulate too much. Sometimes it's not that we regulate too much, but there's the countervailing forces that say, well, I don't want to be regulated so much, and of course the lobbying that goes on with politicians and so on. So I think that the role of the economics profession, we can't get into this day-to-day fights. The role of our economics profession, and a place like BFI is very good at this, is to create the knowledge that we need, and often and also to be able to prepare the communication. But I think that we don't have to get engaged on day-to-day conversations with politicians about what they should be doing. Well, I think a very interesting bubble is the first bubble for which you have good data. The first bubble for which you have good data was the bubble that occurred in England around a company called the South Sea Company. It's a very short bubble. It basically lasts from January 1720 until the fall of that year. So it's a relatively few month bubble, which many bubbles are, by the way. Some last longer. And so that bubble has many of the elements we discussed here. So although there was, in the first place, it was a time in which the South Sea Company, let me describe a little bit the company for you, was a company that had a monopoly of trade between England and what was then called South America. South America is everything up to Mexico, okay? Which, of course, is a very important area for trade. But, of course, South America was all in the hands of Portugal and Spain. And so, and Spain, for reasons we can go into, had difficulties with England, historical difficulties with England. So having a monopoly for trading with your enemy is not worth a lot of money, right? Now, but the South Sea Company had this monopoly, but then they acquired another monopoly, and that was a very important one. The British Crown has a long history issuing debt, and the debt they issued, they always honored, mostly honored. It's very different than the continental dynasties, the kings of France who issue debt, and the next generation, or even the same generation, say, well, I'm not going to pay this, you know. So for this reason, this debt was owned by families in the UK that had money, that had savings, and but there was a problem that a lot of this debt was very heterogeneous because there were things that had been issued a long time ago. They had perpetual debt, for instance, that had been issued a long time ago. The denominations were very different and so on. So there's a lot, and some of them were actually non-tradable. You couldn't trade. So what the South Sea Company arranged was they received the monopoly from the British Crown, from the British Parliament, and of course approved by the Crown, that they would be the only ones to have to be able to do the following. They could acquire debt from other people, even debt that was officially non-tradable, and they would give in exchange a stock certificate, and the person would be entitled to a piece of the dividends that those things were producing, okay? So that was basically the business model. Now, if you think about it, it is the first example we have of financial engineering, because you're transforming that which was highly liquid, which had a lot of different types, into kind of a uniform thing, and now it's a stock certificate, and then you can go and trade. And you started in the UK, and they started trading. People started buying the stuff and speculating. And so that's the first part which is interesting, the innovation. There was an innovation, in this case financial engineering, that started the system. The second thing is that you observe people traded the stock a lot. So one of the interesting things about that period in the UK is that some of the companies that existed then still exist. One of them is the Bank of England. So the Bank of England, that today is like an official organization, was actually a bank. And they had a monopoly similar to the South Sea Company had, but for issuing small denomination notes. So it's a different monopoly, right? But they were, of course, involved in some of the same speculation. And one thing you can see is that people were trading during this period. They traded over 100% a year of the stocks of these companies. Now, to give an idea, that's what today, the order of magnitude, that the typical New York Stock Exchange stock trades. But a trade in New York Stock Exchange, you go into your computer, you press a button and it's done. There you had to go to a place, it was called Exchange Alley. And Exchange Alley, you had to go to Exchange Alley and trade. And if you go to the Tate, you see a picture of a painting of Exchange Alley in 1720. And of course, the painting was done later; it's a 19th century painting. But it shows how important, how much people were involved. It was a very noisy place with people trading and so on. So that's the other characteristic. There was a lot of trading. The third characteristic is how did it implode? And the story implosion of the South Sea Company is very interesting. People figured out, okay, the South Sea Company has this one monopoly. People are trading their stock a lot. So why don't I create a company, a stock company, and issue stock and I can issue the stock, people buy it because, and it's, depending how much it costs me to create the company, it could be a very easy deal. Other companies, where this company that still survives, another company that still survives, was called the Wilkinson Sword Company. And I don't know if there's a version for women, but there's still Wilkinson Blades. I don't know if it's exactly the same company that survived, but has the same name, inspired on the Sword Company. The Wilkinson Sword Company decided that instead of that selling stocks on swords is kind of hard, but they could pretend to be a financial company, which, by the way, it's another common phenomenon that happens in many bubbles. People change their business models, or sometimes don't even change, but just change their names. There's a recent speculation. You can talk about it when we talk about Bitcoins. Some of that happened. So a lot of people started doing those things. Now, the people at the South Sea Company, they were smart, the directors, and they knew that that was competition for them, and their stock was not going to go up in price as much as if they would have gone if there was no other people issuing stocks. Of course, the British Parliament at that time looked a lot like, it was a very corrupt place. And many of the directors of the company were members of Parliament, or members of Parliament were given stock, and so on. So they passed a law making it illegal to create new stock companies unless you had a parliamentary chart. And you couldn't change the business model or announce that you had changed your business model unless you got a new parliamentary chart. So there was a way of kind of holding the supply. Unfortunately for the South Sea Company directors, it came in a little bit too late. And since it came a little bit too late, there's a lot of the stuff, and there simply wasn't enough demand. There were a lot of crazy people who wanted to buy the stock of South Sea Company, but those crazy people started speculating in these other stocks. And as they speculated in these other stocks, the demand for the South Sea Company went down. It didn't continue to go up, so eventually it kind of collapsed. And the other interesting thing about the South Sea Company is that because it happened in England, where you had a press and you had an active press and you also had a lot of thinkers, there's a lot of things contemporaneously writing about. There's a lot of contemporaneous writing about the South Sea bubble. And the contemporaneous writing often talks about, say people are buying the stock, not because they think it's a good business, but because they think that tomorrow somebody's going to pay more for the stock than what they paid. There's a lot of conversation like that. So they understood something strange. And by the way, the word bubble comes from that episode. It doesn't refer to the South Sea Company itself. It refers to the companies that were created to exploit the fever around stocks that appear with the South Sea Company. And because many of them didn't have really a business purpose, a clear business purpose, they were called bubble companies. So the bubble refers out of nothing, bubble in the sense of out of nothing. So the word bubbles did not refer to what we think about rising prices, excessively rising prices. It was really the absence of a real productive business plan on the part of the companies. No, sometimes they help. The interesting thing is that bubbles can be very good for the economy. I think the internet bubble is an example. I don't think we'd have Google if there wasn't for the internet bubble. Not that Google was created at that time, but the whole supported system that it created, including search engines and so on, came from that time. So there are situations in which you have very risky projects, which are hard to finance. If you have a bubble, of course, that becomes more easy around those topics. It becomes easier to finance it, right? Because everybody's excited about it and so on. So bubbles can be very good from that point of view, and I think some bubbles are very effective. I think the bubbles which are bad are the bubbles that contaminate the financial system, the banks and the finance companies and so on, because these bubbles, the aftermath of these bubbles are very, very costly. Whereas the internet bubble, people lost money and probably we see there's a recession that comes a little bit after, but it was not an extraordinary recession, was a typical U.S. recession, so it could have happened in any case. It's not clear the connection one with the other. But in any case, even if it was caused by the implosion of the internet bubble, the social costs were fairly small. when compared with the benefits we have from the weighting technology. And this is very common historically. There was a bubble when radio was introduced. There was a bubble when electricity was introduced. There was a bubble when the microchip was introduced. There was a bubble when biotech started getting warm. So I think that these things are actually beneficial for the system. But if they actually contaminate the financial system and destroy the capacity of banks of making loans and helping business growth and so on, then it's very costly. If you look at the financial system and see they're very involved on a particular type of activity, then you have to worry about no matter what that activity is. And if you see them, let me give you an example that happened in the last big bubble, the one dealing with housing and other assets of the type, and assets related to housing, and many other instruments of credit. Then if you see that not only banks are getting involved, but creating loopholes to get more involved, then you really have to watch. So one of the problems the US had is that not only the banks got involved themselves within the regulatory framework that they were set up, because the regulations had some didn't cover everything, but on top of that, they created new loopholes by creating subsidiaries to which they promise bailouts, essentially, so committing the banking system. But at that point, that risk was not accounted for by the regulators. Well, I think we should try to prevent them. I think that the regulation of the financial system is very important. I think we have to be wary of innovations, not that in finance, not because they're all bad, probably many of them have been good, but because there's a few that can be very bad. So when there is an innovation, we should really be careful about fully understanding the effect of those innovations in the system. And this is something, of course, economists are very well prepared to do, because those are questions we're good at answering. Well, first of all, one of the things I find appealing, and yesterday you were there, we had a meeting with, that involves a lot of young people. I think that's really important. You know, of course, Lars was there, Tom Sargent was there. They're very important figures in the field. But having these young people getting involved, and it's very, very important. So that, I think, creates this new human capital. But also the questions asked are very important. So this kind of a general questions that, you know, macroeconomics and behavior, in some sense, that's a general question. But the specific questions they're asking, for instance, a question related to climate economics and climate finance, are really substantial questions. I mean, those are questions that will help us understand the welfare impact or the economic impact of the phenomenon of global warming, which is something we're living and for which there is a lot of uncertainty concerning its outcome. When I say uncertain, it doesn't mean there could be a very good outcome. That doesn't seem possible. But there's a bad outcome and there are horrible outcomes. So in that range, we have to understand how to deal, what's the social cost of this? This is the kind of question that economists can answer. Often when I'm in discussions of this type, I realize that the science is uncertain, as every science is, but the science gives us a very clear message that things are going to be not very good. So then then you have to go beyond the science to go to the social scientists, in the case of the economist, says, what is the impact of all these possible scenarios we'll have, and how are we treating it, and what's the impact having today on risks and so on. So that's the second theme. And this is a subject for which communication is very important, because I think in the public still looks at things like uncertainty as meaning, well, if there's uncertainty we don't really know, we shouldn't do anything about. Economists have known for a long time that it's exactly in situations you have a lot of uncertainty. Those are the situations where you have to act now, you know, because you could have a very bad payoff. So that's something that we can contribute to that discussion very much. The uncertainty, scientific uncertainty, it's unavoidable because it's a very hard problem. It's a very, very difficult problem. And I expect scientists to guess how much the average temperature will be 5 years from now. It's a crazy demand. It's a very, very difficult, it's an impossible problem, I'll tell you. But what they can do is make a certain set of glasses, say it's going to be within this range, and it's the role of us economists to think, given that uncertainty, what are the right actions we should be taking now? This idea that the model of what we used to call equilibrium expectation or rational expectations, which has been a very, very useful model, is incapable of treating certain questions. So a lot of what we saw yesterday with this idea that we need models that actually recognize that the agents in the model are uncertain about what's going on. And they have to observe, and the model has to treat that, and what does that result in, and how do we think about it, and even how do we estimate a model like this, which is a discussion that's continuing today in the next conference. It's the same thing on bubbles. So there are questions, this question of over trading is clear. People trade too much. Now we have to accept, to say that people trade so much, we have to accept the idea that not everybody agrees. Now, in equilibrium economics or rational expectation economics, it's really hard to agree to disagree. There's a whole literature showing you cannot agree to disagree. But if you ever observe financial markets, or if you, like me during certain periods in life, participated in financial markets, you know that all you're doing, you're doing trades because you disagree with the average opinion. You think things are going to go up more than what the normal rate of return. Otherwise, why would you buy it? And so there's no way you can escape that. Now, psychologists have had have studied this question: why do people disagree so much? And one of the things they've proposed is that people tend to trust too much the information that they think is good, whereas other people may trust another set of information. Okay, they put too much confidence on a certain set of information. So as a result, we all think we know more than we do because we think that the signals we pay attention to are the good ones. Now, if you watch a political debate with people from a different political view, you'd see the same debate. At the end of the debate, you think your candidate did better. The other person would think the other candidate did better. So why is that? Well, maybe they started with different priors, which is possible. That's also part of the story. But also the interpretation of the same signal sometimes is very different by people. Probably because they trust that signal more than the other. For whatever reason, the interpretation they give to exactly the same signal. So that's something psychologists have observed, and that comes into my discussion, because I don't think you can ever understand bubbles if you don't understand why do people trade so much during bubbles. Well, first of all, you need disagreement, as I say, because you have to explain trading. Now, in many cases, if you're really just interested in the phenomenon of bubble and the phenomenon of excessive trading, you don't need any asymmetry across individuals. So they could all be wrong in their own way. That's okay. They can be symmetrically wrong, in the sense that sometimes I'm wrong, sometimes you are wrong, but all wrong in the same way. We follow different signals. For whatever reason, we put more trust in some sets of signals than others, but in a very symmetric fashion. That doesn't play any. So that's what you're interested in. Now, when you're thinking about, for instance, reactions of supply or reactions of how do people increase the supply of these assets and so on, those people have to have a view. They have to be, in some sense, understand better what's going on than the people participating on the trading. So these people have to have a view a view that, well, I'm going to create this company. It's not going to cost me very much. I'm going to sell the stock at a high price. So these people understand what's going on better then the people just buy in the stock that the person is issuing. Now, maybe they have a different technology for creating companies, etc. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't work. You know, I told you I was going to give you a recent phenomenon. So right now, or not so much now because prices have dropped, but about a year, 2 years ago, there's a frenzy on Bitcoin. So everybody was excited, not everybody, there was a group of people very excited about Bitcoins, etc. Now, there were two companies that I know that I saw change their names or change their business models, say they no longer do what they usually do. They're going to be what they call a company doing something related to cryptocurrencies. You know, what they would do exactly, so they would explain it. That varies from company to company. One is a company called the Long Island Tea Company, which is a company making tea. Now, why would people believe that a firm like this would have any advantage in the business of cryptocurrencies is something that completely... but the price popped up. Now, of course, now we live in a different world than we live in during the 18th century, so these people are being sued for fraud or whatever, but it seems that people are willing to do that. So that's an extreme case, of course. The other is a venerable company, a really venerable company, one of the great companies of the 20th century called Kodak. Now, maybe you're too young to know about Kodak, but there was a time where everybody was using, you know, these instant cameras made by Kodak. They used Kodak films, etc. Of course, the technology changed. Everybody now uses their phones to take pictures, or even cameras which are completely electronic. So the company doesn't have a business anymore. And they made an announcement at some point they're going to go into the crypto business. I don't remember exactly what they're going to do in it. So, of course, but again, the stock, which has been for a long time now, you know, worth very little money because they don't have much of a business left, popped up and so on. So that gives you an idea that people make use of those things. You know, we know that countries like Greece changed the way certain things were accounted so they could get more credit, they could borrow more money, etc. You know, somebody understood that. Somebody who bought the credit did not understand that what they were doing is that changing their accounting standards. So those are something you always have to worry. So there are always some people that take advantage. But the phenomena occurs mostly because there are people that have their own views about the world. They disagree. They have this idea that if they buy today, somebody in the future is going to get a very good signal about that, and that's going to be willing to pay a lot of money, so they're going to be able to sell back. So people buy to sell, not buy to hold. And then you get all this extra trading. But then some people figure out, well, what they're buying, I can make something that looks almost like it. You know, instead of being purple is red, but otherwise it looks almost like it. And that's when you see people exploiting the bubble phenomenon.